The letter came in November, folded twice inside an envelope that had been handled by at least 3 people before it reached her. She could tell by the way the corners had softened, the way the seal had been pressed back down with something that was not the original glue. She read it standing at the window of Mrs. Alderton's boarding house in Winnipeg, while the first real snow of the season moved sideways past the glass. Seeking capable woman for household management and farm work, situated near Stonewall, Manitoba. Widow or unattached preferred. Provide. Accommodation provided. Terms by arrangement. Reply to general. Delivery. Stonewall. She read it twice. Then she set it on the windowsill and looked at the snow. She had come from Kenora after the mill closed and taken the one position she could find, which was in Mrs. Alderton's boarding house, carrying linens and making beds and listening through thin walls to the lives of people passing through. It was not a bad life. It was not a life either. She was 31 years old, and she had been not living for long enough that she had stopped expecting it to change on its own. Her brother had died in the spring. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though she thought it was the winter more than anything. The particular kind of winter that gets into a man who has been working too hard for too long, and finds the places where his resistance has worn thin. He had left her what he had, which was the contents of a small room above a hardware store, and the knowledge that she was now entirely without anchor. She wrote back on a Thursday. She used plain language. She described what she could do, which was considerable. She did not describe what she could not do, which was return to a life of waiting for something that would not come on its own. The reply arrived in 12 days. 2 sentences. The 3rd of December will suit. I will arrange to meet the train at 2:30. The handwriting was angular and even. No decoration. She noted that and packed her trunk. She arrived on a Wednesday into cold that was different from Winnipeg cold. Drier. The sky had a particular quality she would come to recognize over the following months. A pale, hard blue that looked like it had been wrung out and stretched tight over the land. The station at Stonewall was a single room with a wood stove and a bench. A man behind a wicket looked up when she came in, registered her trunk, and looked down again. She set her things by the bench and waited. 2:30 came and went. The stove ticked. Outside the platform was empty in both directions. A freight wagon had come and gone. While she watched through the window, the driver hunched into his coat, not looking left or right. At 3:15, she approached the wicket and asked if there was a livery in town. There was. The man at the wicket told her without inflection that the livery was on the main street, South End, and that the homestead she was likely looking for was north of town, maybe 6 miles, and that the road was passable but not easy in this weather. She thanked him and moved her trunk to the door. The liveryman was named Strachan. He was older, with a face like the bark of a poplar, pale and furrowed, and he looked at her trunk and then at her and asked where she was headed. When she told him, his expression did the thing she had learned to watch for in men of a certain age, a small contraction, as though he had decided in that moment to recalibrate something. He did not say what he was recalibrating. He named a price. She paid it without negotiating, because the cold outside had already told her what negotiating would cost her, and she carried one end of her trunk while he carried the other. The road north was unpacked snow over frozen ground, and the horse picked its way with the careful indifference of an animal that had made this trip enough times to have opinions about it. She sat straight on the board seat and kept her hands in her lap. The fields on both sides were flat and white and enormous. The sky pressed down close. She did not find it oppressive. She found it honest. Land that looked like this was not hiding anything. What it had, it showed you. The homestead came over a slight rise, and she saw it before she expected to. A house, low and square, built of lumber that had weathered to silver gray. A barn behind it, larger than the house, which told her something. A man who puts more money into his barn than his house is a man who understands which one earns and which one doesn't. There was a log outbuilding to one side, a root cellar with a door that listed slightly, and a fence line that ran east into the tree line and had been repaired in places with new posts set at different angles than the old ones. She studied it the way she studied everything she expected to have to know well, not looking for flaws, just reading. A man came around the corner of the barn as the wagon pulled into the yard. He was in his early 40s, or had been younger and become this, tall, broad through the shoulders that had seen several winters. He stopped when he saw the wagon and stood still in a way that was not unfriendly, only contained. The way a man stands when he is deciding how to approach something he has been thinking about for a while. He did not come to help her down. She set the reins, climbed down herself, and stood in the yard. Her boots found the packed snow and she adjusted her balance and looked at him across the distance between them. He walked toward her. Not quickly. He had a particular gait, economical, like someone who had learned early that the land does not reward rushing and had applied that lesson to everything else in his life as well. He said she had made it. She said the train had been on time. He nodded once as though this were information he was filing away. He looked at her trunk in the back of the wagon. He looked at the sky to the northwest, which was doing something with the light that she had not yet learned to read, but that he clearly had because his jaw set slightly when he looked at it. He said they should get inside. She took one end of the trunk. He took the other without discussion, and they carried it across the yard and up the 2 steps to the door. Inside was a kitchen with a wood stove along the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves with dry goods on the lower boards and miscellaneous hardware on the upper ones. A doorway to the right led to a second room, which she could see held a cot with a wool blanket and a small window that faced south. Coat on a peg near the door. A pair of boots set beneath it with the precision of a man who lived alone and had made his own order. The stove was going. She noted that. He had kept it going before she arrived, which meant he had been planning the timing of her arrival, even if he hadn't been at the station. He set the trunk down in the corner room and straightened and looked at the window for a moment before he looked at her. He said the room was hers. He said there was water in the reservoir on the stove and that he had brought wood in that morning. He said supper was her arrangement to make, that there were provisions in the cold room off the kitchen, and that he generally ate at 6. She said she understood. He went out. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened to him move across the yard. Then she took off her coat and hung it on the second peg beside the door, which was empty, and went to look at the provisions. The cold room held a haunch of salted pork, a crock of lard, dried beans, a wheel of hard cheese with 1/4 already gone, a bag of oats, and several jars of put-up vegetables that she examined one by one, tomatoes, green beans. A jar of something orange, she thought, might be carrots in brine. The jars were not store-bought. Someone had done this work. She did not yet know who, and she did not ask. She made a meal from what she found. Salt pork, beans from the dried stock that she soaked in hot water for as long as she could before the hour demanded a compromise, cornbread from the meal she located in a tin on the lower shelf. She found the plates in a cabinet above the stove. 2 plates, as though he had thought about this. When he came in at 6, he washed at the basin without comment and sat at the table. She set the plate in front of him and sat across with her own. They ate. Outside, the wind had started up and she could hear it going around the corners of the house. He ate with focus and without haste. She ate the same way. He said the pork was good. She said it would be better if he had molasses. He looked up then, not startled. She said she had seen they were out. She would get some in town when she went. He said town was far in the winter. She said she had walked farther. He considered this. He did not challenge it. He went back to his food and she went back to hers, and outside the wind settled into its long, patient work against the eaves. After supper, she washed the dishes and he sat at the table with a ledger. He did not speak, and neither did she, and there was nothing hostile in the silence. It had the quality of 2 people who have each learned that silence can be a neutral country if you let it be. She went to her room and unpacked her trunk by the light of the lamp she had found on the shelf above the bed. 2 dresses, one heavier, a wool cardigan her brother had left that she had taken because it was warm, and because taking it had seemed like something she was owed. A small tin box that she set on the windowsill. A Bible she no longer read but carried. Needles and thread in an oilcloth packet. A pair of her brother's work gloves, too large for her, that she had brought for outdoor work because her own pair had worn through at the palm. She pushed the trunk under the cot and sat on the edge of it and looked at the room. The walls were board and batten, gaps filled with oakum. The floor was level, which she had not expected. Someone had taken care with the floor. The window had a curtain, a plain cotton one bleached to near white, and she straightened it on its rod before she lay down. Outside, the wind ran across the fields in long, unbroken sweeps, and she listened to it and thought about what she had seen of the land, and what it would look like in spring, and whether she would still be here to see it. She woke before light and lay still for a moment, locating herself in the dark. Then she got up. The stove in the kitchen was low but not out. She fed it and put water on, and started breakfast from what she'd inventoried the night before. Oats, the remaining heel of bread, the last of the cheese cut thin. He came in from outside before she had expected him, already in his coat, which meant he had been up earlier than she had, which she filed away without comment. He stopped inside the door and looked at the stove and then at her. He said good morning the way a man says it who has not said it to another person at breakfast in a long time, and is remembering that this is what you do. She said the same. He sat. She put the food out and they ate. She asked him what he ran on the place. He told her 40 head of cattle, a milk cow whose production had been poor since fall, 6 hogs in the barn lot, and about 30 acres under winter wheat that he had not had confidence in since November because the moisture had been wrong. He said it the way you say something when you have been thinking about it alone for a long time and have not found a solution, but have memorized the shape of the problem. She asked about the fence line to the east, the one she had seen from the wagon. He said it had come down in a windstorm in October. He had repaired what he could, but the corner posts needed resetting, and the ground had frozen before he got to it. She asked if he had the posts. He said he had lumber. He hadn't cut them yet. She said she could help with that when the weather allowed. He looked at her across the table, not with skepticism, and not with the particular patience that men sometimes applied to women they intended to disregard. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has said something useful and unexpected, and he was deciding whether to treat it as useful or unexpected. He said he'd keep that in mind. She nodded and got up to clear the plates. The milk cow was in the near stall of the barn. She found her way there that afternoon while he was working in the back pasture. The cow was a roan shorthorn, older, with the look of an animal that had decided to conserve her energy in all directions. The udder was not swollen, which meant she was producing something, but the teats showed signs of chapping, and the bedding in her stall was not clean enough. She stood in the stall doorway and looked at the cow, and the cow looked back at her with the mild suspicion of an animal assessing a stranger. She went back to the house and looked through the shelves in the cold room until she found a tin of petroleum jelly she had noticed the previous evening. She took it out to the barn. She worked slowly, letting the animal settle to her, speaking in a low, even tone that was not sentimental, simply sound, the way you use sound to tell a creature that you are not a threat. When she had finished, she cleaned the stall, forked fresh bedding from the pile in the corner, and checked the water trough. Coming back through the barn, she passed the tool wall. The tools were hung neatly, which confirmed something about him she had already suspected. A man who hangs his tools has a system. She looked at the tools without touching them. An axe, a draw knife, 2 crosscut saws of different lengths, a broken singletree that had been set aside for repair, an ice chisel, a post-hole digger that looked new or newer than everything else. That evening the milk was better. Not good, but better. He noticed when he came in from the evening chores. He set the pail on the counter and looked at the quantity and then at her. She was at the stove and did not turn around. He didn't say anything, but she heard him set the pail down with a different weight than the night before, careful, like something he didn't want to spill. 3 days later, she walked to the Carvalho place a mile east on the road because she had seen smoke from their chimney in the mornings and had decided it meant someone was home. A woman named Margot Carvalho came to the door, perhaps 60, with white hair and the efficient bearing of someone who had run a large household for a very long time. She looked at her in the doorway without surprise. She said she had heard there was someone out there now. She said she had come to ask about the nearest place to buy dried nettle, or to find it if it grew locally. Margot looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come in." They sat in the kitchen for an hour. Margot knew where the nettle grew, along the creek in the summer, but she had some dried from August that she pressed into a paper bag with the directness of a woman who did not waste time on indirection. She also said the water in the south quarter of the property was likely the problem with the cow, something in the ground near that fence line, and that the previous woman who had kept that house had moved the cow's water intake to the north trough after she noticed the same thing. She asked who the previous woman had been. Margot said his wife. She said it the way you say something that is not a secret, but is still handled carefully, because it has edges. She said she had been a capable woman. She said she had been gone 3 years come February. She thanked her for the nettle and the information. She walked home into a wind that had dropped to something merely uncomfortable, and she thought about capable women and what they left behind when they left. That evening she mixed the nettle into the cow's feed herself. He watched from the stall doorway without comment. She could feel him deciding whether to ask where she had gotten it. He didn't ask. The week turned and then another. She settled into the rhythms of the house the way you settle into cold water. Not by pretending it isn't cold, but by moving through it until your body adjusts. She learned the stove's particular habits. The left burner ran hotter, and she cooked accordingly. She learned that he was up at 4:30 without variation, and that the sound of him in the barn was the reliable background of the early morning. She learned that the ledger on the shelf was something he returned to every few evenings, turning pages back and forth in a way that suggested he was not looking for new information, but reviewing something that already troubled him. She did not open the ledger. She found other ways to know what she needed to know. The account at the general store in Stonewall was carried by a man named Dunfield, who ran the mercantile with his daughter-in-law. When she walked in for the first time and gave the claim name, Dunfield's daughter-in-law, a narrow woman named Patrice, had a particular way of not meeting her eyes that told her the account was not comfortable. She bought cornmeal and a tin of baking powder and paid from her own money, the last of what she had saved, and said she would be back in 2 weeks. On the walk home, she thought about the fence line and the posts that hadn't been cut. She thought about 40 head of cattle going into a Manitoba winter on a farm whose account at the mercantile was not comfortable. She thought about what comfortable meant in that context and decided it meant the account would extend through February if nothing went wrong, and probably not through March if anything did. She said none of this to him that evening. She said she thought the cornbread needed a little more salt. He said he had thought so too. They ate. 2 Sundays after she arrived, the temperature dropped to something that stopped being a number and became simply a condition, a presence, like a new tenant in the house who had not been invited. She woke in the night to the sound of the stove in the kitchen, making the particular sound of a stove that is working very hard and still losing ground. And she got up and found him already in the kitchen, adding wood. He had his coat on over his night clothes. She had her cardigan and her heavy skirt, and she tied the cardigan closed as she came through the door. He said she didn't need to be up. She went to the stove and looked at the fire and saw it needed tending, not just feeding. She opened the damper slightly and shifted the wood, and in a few minutes the sound changed. He stood back and watched her do this. She did not explain what she had done. He would see the result and draw his own conclusions, which was the same thing. She said she would check the root cellar in the morning, that in this cold the vegetables might need moving. He said the potatoes would be all right. She said it was the carrots she was concerned about. They froze at a higher temperature. He looked at her a long moment. Then he said he hadn't thought of that. She said she would go first thing. She went back to her room and listened to the cold do its work on the house and thought about the carrots and the fence posts and the milk cow and the ledger she had not opened, and at some point she fell asleep. The carrots were fine. They were stored deeper than she had expected, in a bin that someone had lined with straw, which she noted. In the morning, she restocked the indoor wood supply and made breakfast, and he ate it and went out. And she stood at the kitchen window, looking at the fields which were flat and white and very still, the cold having pressed even the wind out of commission. Fence posts were cut in January, when a warm spell came down from the southwest for 4 days and softened the ground enough to work. She worked alongside him without being asked and without discussion. She had found his post hole digger and the iron bar for breaking crust, and she brought them to the east fence line and began on the corner post while he worked north along the run. He stopped after a while and looked at her working. She kept digging. He went back to his own hole. They set 4 posts that afternoon and strung the wire between the new ones before the temperature began to drop again at dusk. Walking back to the house, she was aware of how tired her arms were, and she did not show it. At supper, he said the east line would hold now through spring. She said that was good. He said it was better than good. He said it was what the cattle needed. She looked at her plate. She said the cattle would be all right. He said he knew. He said it with a plainness that meant he hadn't known until recently and was now beginning to. In February, a man named Everett Broussard came to the farm looking to sell a portion of late-cut hay he had stored in his barn and couldn't move before spring made it not worth moving. He was in his 50s, red-faced, with the particular type of confidence that belongs to men who have been told yes enough times that no has begun to seem impolite. He stood in the yard and talked past her at first. She stood in the yard and waited. When he had finished explaining the hay to him, who was standing slightly behind her, she said the moisture content was the question and had he tested it. Broussard looked at her. She said late-cut hay stored in a warm winter barn was a question of moisture and whether it had heated. She asked if he had tested it. He said he hadn't thought it necessary. She said she would like to see it before any arrangement was made. There was a silence. Broussard looked at him. He said nothing, which was itself something. They went to look at the hay. It was partially heated in the center bales, which she found by pushing her arm into the stack and holding it there for 60 seconds, a thing she had learned on her brother's farm a long time ago. She pulled her arm out and showed Broussard where the heat was. He adjusted his price. She negotiated him down further, and they took half the lot. On the way back in the wagon, Broussard said to her, in a tone that had rearranged itself towards something like respect, that she knew her business. She said she knew enough. He left them at the gate. They unloaded the hay in the barn without discussing Broussard or the price, or what had happened in the field with the stack. He stacked and she passed, and the work went at an easy pace in the cold afternoon light. March came slowly and then all at once. She had planted the kitchen garden in a notebook first, the way she always did, rows and dates, and the particular logic of what needed to go where based on what she had seen of the light on the south side of the house. When the ground allowed it, she started turning the beds. He watched her do this one morning from the barn door. She could see him in her peripheral vision, and she did not look up from what she was doing. Later, he came and stood at the edge of the plot and asked what she was putting in. She told him. Root vegetables along the north end, greens toward the south where they'd bolt less in full sun. Potatoes in the back where the soil looked deepest. She had taken a sample from the bed and worked it with her hands and found it good but tired, and she said so that it had been cropped without being rested, that she would work compost in from the pile behind the barn before she planted anything heavy. He said the pile behind the barn had not been turned in 2 years. She said she had seen that. He said he would turn it. She said she would do the east half. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, all right. They turned the compost pile on a Saturday in late March, the sun coming in at a new angle that had warmth in it for the first time. Real warmth, not the temporary kind. She could smell the earth releasing itself from the cold, and it was a smell she had missed in a way she hadn't let herself notice until it came back. She worked steadily, not competing with him, but not deferring either. They finished in the early afternoon, and she was tired in a way that was good, physical, clean. He said he would make coffee. It was the first time he had offered to make anything. She washed her hands at the outdoor basin and followed him inside and sat at the table for the first time since she had arrived. She was usually standing when she was in the kitchen, cooking or cleaning, or looking out the window. Sitting felt different. The table looked different from this angle. The surface worn in the center where his arms had rested for years, rough at the far edge where no one had sat. He put a cup in front of her. He sat across with his own. Outside the yard was beginning to look like something. The fence line held. The root cellar door had been rehung on proper hinges. The south garden was turned and the compost pile reduced. Small things, each of them, taken one by one, each of them was nothing. Added together, they were the difference between a farm that was giving up and a farm that was not. She wrapped both hands around the cup. He said the milk had been right for 3 weeks. She said the north trough had made the difference. He said he knew about the South Water. He said he'd known for 2 years, but had not wanted to admit what fixing it would cost. She said it hadn't cost much. He said it had cost something. He said it looking at his cup and not at her, and she understood that he did not mean money. He meant the particular cost of being helped by someone you have not asked to help you, which is different from being helped by someone you have. She said nothing for a while. He drank his coffee. Outside, a sparrow landed on the fence post nearest the window and then left. The yard was still. In the distance, the winter wheat field showed the first fine green. Almost nothing, almost color, almost enough. He said he had not expected her to stay. She looked up. He said he had placed the notice because the land required it, because there were things that needed doing, and he did not have the means to do all of them. He said he had told himself that was all it was, an arrangement, practical, bounded. Said, a man could convince himself of a great deal when the alternative was looking at something true. She waited. He said she had shown him what the place could be. Not by telling him, by simply making it so, one thing at a time, without asking for acknowledgement or even permission, moving through his house and his land as though she had decided it was worth the effort and had not required his agreement to decide it. He set the cup down. He said he was not certain how to say what he was trying to say. She said he was saying it. He looked at her then. The light came in through the east window and lay across the table between them. Outside, the sparrow came back to the fence post, and this time it stayed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she had come expecting a place to work and a way to be useful and nothing beyond that. She said she had stopped expecting more than that a long time ago. He asked if that had changed. She looked at the window. She looked at the fence post and the sparrow on it and the field beyond, the thin green of the wheat barely showing, new and tentative and already there. She said it had. He did not reach across the table. He did not move quickly. He put his hand on the table between them, palm down, and left it there. A question, not a demand. She looked at his hand, the work in it, the cold seasons in it, and she put her hand over his. They sat that way while the coffee called and the yard outside went about its business in the light, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was exactly what was needed. Spring pressed on. The wheat came up properly, and he walked the rows in the evenings, and she would see him from the garden, stopping here and there to crouch and look at the ground the way a man looks when he is beginning to believe in something again. The kitchen garden came in strong along the south bed, and she staked the tomato plants on a Thursday afternoon with strips of cloth she had cut from a worn-out pillowcase, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a task done right with what you had on hand. A woman from the next property to the north stopped at the gate one afternoon in April. Her name was Siobhan Merritt, younger than her by several years, with a direct way of speaking and a baby on her hip. She said she had heard the east quarter fence was back up and that the place was looking different from the road. She said it was coming along. Siobhan looked at the garden and at the barn door, which had been rehung level, and at the fence line. She said it was more than coming along. She said her husband had told her the place had been going quiet for the last few years and that it was good to see it otherwise. She thanked her. They talked for a few minutes about the spring and the wheat and the road conditions. When Siobhan left, she stood at the gate for a moment looking at the property from that vantage, the way a stranger would see it. The house, the barn, the fence line, the wood pile stacked square, the garden showing green, a thin thread of smoke from the chimney. It looked, from the road, like a place that had decided to persist. That evening he came in for supper and set his hat on the peg and looked at the table, which she had laid with the extra cloth she had found in the cedar chest in the back room. Not ceremony, just cloth, but enough to make the table look like what it was. A place where two people ate together and were neither one of them alone anymore. He sat. He said the wheat was going to be a good stand this year. She said she thought so too. He asked if she had seen the meadowlarks that morning along the south fence. She said she had heard them. He said he hadn't heard them in a few years. He said it the way you say something small that means something larger and trusts the other person to know the difference. She did. Outside, the evening came on in its slow prairie way, the light lasting long past the point where it seemed like it should, holding on and then going gently when it finally went. Inside, the lamp burned low and sufficient, and the house was warm, and the sound of the land at the end of a long day was the only sound they needed to hear.